As you will probably know, I have led the initiative to have the BDS resolution adopted as party policy, and although it has attracted a very considerable amount of controversy, I've continued to advocate for the adoption and preservation of this policy. And in helping members of the party and the public to understand my motivation, I think it's critical that I explain at least my perspective on the reality confronting the Palestinian people. It's often described in the Western press, and I won't be shy about saying that the Western press, when it comes to the plight of the Palestinian people, has done an abominable job of informing the public, not just in this country but elsewhere, of the facts on the ground. And the word they often use to describe what is being done to the Palestinian people is a conflict. It surely is a conflict, but simply stating that it's a conflict doesn't disclose any information about the relative power enjoyed by the two sides to that conflict. And in fact, that word masks that there is a grotesque disparity of power between the two sides, and that the relationship between the State of Israel and the people of Palestine is one of oppressor to oppressed. And I don't think that a fair review of the facts, an objective, fair review of the facts on the ground could possibly lead to any other conclusion. And why do I say that? I say that first and foremost because for some 70 years or so, the people of Israel have had a sovereign state, and all that that entails, including freedom of movement, freedom to formulate domestic policy, freedom to formulate foreign policy, whereas at no time during that period have the Palestinian people, who are equally deserving of self-determination, not even for 1 year have they had their own state. And there's no prospect that they're going to have one anytime soon if we don't act. Furthermore, for almost 50 years, the Palestinian people have been occupied, and as I will explain, in a rather brutal manner. Furthermore, there is prosperity, relative prosperity for the Jewish population of Israel and relative poverty for the Palestinian population, both within Israel and in the occupied territories. In 2014, Gaza's unemployment rate set a world record at 47%. Imagine, nearly 1/2 of the population is unemployed in Gaza. By comparison, West Bank Palestinians are living in the lap of luxury at 18%, but relative to Western standards of unemployment, that's nearly Depression-era levels of unemployment. In August of this year, the unemployment rate in Israel was 4.6%, which I'm pretty sure is significantly below the unemployment rate, even in our own country, one of the wealthiest in the world. Israel, interestingly, has the highest poverty rate in the OECD at 21%, almost double the OECD average of 11%. However, poverty in Israel falls disproportionately upon its Arab Palestinian population. According to a March 2011 report by the Legal Center for Arab Minority Rights in Israel, over 50% of Arab families in Israel lived in poverty, over 1/2. Of the 40 towns in Israel with the highest unemployment, 36 were Arab towns. The employment rate, I should say, for Arabs was 68%, a little more than 2/3 of the employment rate for the Jewish population of Israel. And in September 2014, the World Bank reported that 1 in 4 of the persons living in the occupied Palestinian territories lives in poverty. Of course, this should be something we don't have to debate. There is overwhelming military superiority enjoyed by the State of Israel. It not only has the Middle East's only nuclear arsenal and refuses to accede to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, I might add. It also has advanced fighters and bombers, drones, tanks, a sophisticated missile defense system from the United States, advanced attack helicopters and cruise missiles. I didn't mention it here, but there's also a navy, a fleet of warships and submarines. Hamas, by contrast, and I'm no fan of Hamas, let me be clear about that, but let's talk about the relative military strength of the two sides. Hamas possesses crude, notoriously inaccurate rockets that Israel-Palestine scholar Norman Finkelstein describes as glorified fireworks. As one would expect in a situation of such disparate military power, the casualties on the two sides are also vastly disparate. in Israel's last 3 assaults on Gaza, nearly 4,000 Palestinians were killed, whereas 90 Israelis were killed. And of those 90 Israelis, 70 were soldiers, of whom 4 were killed by friendly fire. Of the nearly 4,000 Palestinians killed, over 550 were children. And in Israel's last assault in 2014 in Gaza alone, 3,374 Palestinian children were wounded, of whom over 1,000 were left permanently disabled. And I'm not even talking here about the psychological trauma that has been caused to the very large population of children in Gaza. And these 3 assaults on Gaza, which the Israeli military refers to shockingly as mowing the lawn, the overall ratio of Palestinian dead to Israeli dead was approximately 40-1. And just ponder for a moment, how can one convey or suggest, as is often done in the media, that the Palestinian people are the aggressor, that the rate of losses is 40-1. There is no doubt from a legal perspective that the settlements violate the 4th Geneva Convention. This was so held over 10 years ago by the International Court of Justice, unanimously and with the concurrence of the United States judge. Multiple Security Council resolutions to which the U.S. itself has acceded so declare. Canada, the U.S., and the EU have all acknowledged that the settlements violate the 4th Geneva Convention, and very importantly, Article 1 of the 4th Geneva Convention obliges all of the parties not only to respect the convention themselves, but to ensure respect for the convention, quote, in all circumstances. Our government, as our state, as a contracting party to the 4th Geneva Convention, therefore has an obligation to ensure that its close ally Israel complies with the 4th Geneva Convention. And by failing to take steps to ensure that it does comply, for example, the imposition of peaceful economic and political sanctions, our government is itself violating Article 1 of the 4th Geneva Convention. What does Amnesty International, which I hope we can all agree is a reputable human rights organization, have to say about the state of life for the Palestinian people? These excerpts come from the most recent report of 2015-2016. Quote, in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, Israeli forces committed unlawful killings of Palestinian civilians, including children. Israeli military police and security forces, quote, tortured and otherwise ill-treated Palestinian detainees, including children, particularly during arrest and interrogation. And the report goes on, I omitted to put it in here, that this torture occurs with impunity. That's the word that Amnesty International uses. Quote, on numerous occasions, journalists covering protests and other developments in the West Bank were assaulted or shot by Israeli police and military forces. In the West in East Jerusalem, Israeli forces demolished at least 510 Palestinian homes and other structures built without Israeli permits, which are virtually impossible to obtain. Imagine yourself living in your own homeland, and you're required to obtain the consent of an external military power that has brutally occupied your homeland for 50 years, simply to build on your own land. It is impossible to obtain a permit, virtually impossible, and if you have the courage to defy the military power, your home is demolished. Put yourself in the situation of the Palestinian people and ask yourselves how you would feel about that. Israeli forces maintain their land, sea, and air blockade of Gaza in force since 2017, imposing collective punishment on the territory's 1.8 million inhabitants. I can assure you that collective punishment violates Article 33 of the 4th Geneva Convention, as does torture. So the settlement is only one of the violations of the 4th Geneva Convention being committed year after year with impunity by the State of Israel. Rehab Nazal, in the latter part of last year, she splits her time between Bethlehem and the University of Western Ontario and the city where I reside, where she's completing her doctorate. She was in the center, the commercial center of Bethlehem, and she was filming, that's all she was doing, the activities of Israeli skunk trucks. These trucks pour noxious fluid not only on protesters who are throwing rocks, but oftentimes on the homes of Palestinians as they are in their homes, not posing any threat to anybody. And that's what they were doing on this occasion. And if you look on the far left of this photo, behind the brick wall, you'll see a green image. That is an Israeli soldier pointing a rifle at Rehab Nazal. And that's the last picture she took before she took a bullet to the leg, as she was doing nothing more than filming Israeli skunk trucks. Has the Canadian government done anything to vindicate the rights of this Canadian citizen? I assure you that it has not done one thing. I traveled to Bethlehem to meet with Rehab, and she took me on a tour of a human rights horror show. First, we met this gentleman who lives outside of Bethlehem. This is a 70-year-old Palestinian farmer. And one of the things that I learned on this trip, I was operating under the misimpression that the separation wall, which is a violation of the Fourth Geneva Convention, in as much as it confiscates Palestinian land, is not stationary. I thought it was done. It's actually expanding relentlessly. And this particular wall that you see behind this gentleman, this is part of the expansion, and it has now come down this hill. On top of that hill, there's an Israeli settlement. And it is surrounding an orchard that has been in his family for generations. An orchard with ancient olive trees, lemon trees, and his own beehives. And on the particular day when we were there, it was the Sabbath, and so there were no soldiers. So we were able to pass through an opening in the uncompleted wall, and he took us for a tour. And at the orchard, he said to us, "They are breaking my connection to the land. A connection that I have had with this land for my entire life." And I assure you that as a member of the Green Party of Canada, that those words mean a great deal to me. We then went into the center of Bethlehem, and we saw this watchtower and section of the wall, and you'll see in the middle of the wall, right there, a little orange rectangle. That is a window that slides open, as Rehab explained to me. And from time to time, as Palestinians are peacefully protesting, someone will stick a gun out and shoot rubber bullets at the protesters. She then took me into the shell of a building, which was, I would say, 30 meters. And by the way, you're looking at the end of the street where Rehab was shot. And she took me into the shell of the building, which was, I would say, 20, 30 meters from this wall. And we walked up to the second floor. Anybody can go in there. And this is what we saw. And as I was walking around, I noticed that there were canisters that looked like spent tear gas shells. And in fact, they were. And I gathered them up, and I put them on the wall. And this is just a very small sample of what I saw. And Rehab explained to me that these are actually toxic, and they have to be gathered up frequently by the Israeli government, but by the Palestinian Authority in Bethlehem. But there are so many of them being fired that within a matter of days, the streets and this building are filled with them again. And as I was inspecting these tear gas canisters, and there were markings of U.S. military contractors on them, I heard some voices over the wall. I looked over the wall, and I saw these children. Somehow, in the almost total despair in which these children live, they have managed to dream of a better life. And I say that as a party, we have an obligation to help them fulfill that dream. I watched an interview of Gideon Levy, an extraordinarily courageous Israeli journalist who works for Haaretz, and he was interviewed by Max Blumenthal, a Jewish-American journalist who has been a relentless critic, and rightly so, of the state of Israel, and this was at the AIPAC conference in Washington. And Max asked Gideon, "Why do you always tell people to go to Hebron?" And Gideon said, "I would start there because there you get it in a nutshell. There is no other place where you can see the Israeli policy, the Israeli apartheid in the West Bank, in such crystal clear colors. Roads are just separated for Jews and for Palestinians. An empty town because all the Palestinian inhabitants had to run away. I mean, the settlers terrorized them so much until most of them, there really remained only those who have no place to go. And you see the tyranny of the settlers, their brutality. They are the most extreme settlers, and they are part of them should be questioned by psychiatrists. I mean, really, and only a very small piece of land, because that's what the commercial center of Hebron is. And that's the way it could have, and it will look one day if this occupation will continue. So you get it in a nutshell. Well, I wanted to see Israeli apartheid in all its colors. Was Gideon Levy right? First, we walked through the ancient core of the city. These are cobbled streets, and there were merchants, and their doors were open, but there were no customers, absolutely none. The economy was being suffocated before our very eyes. It was a beautiful day in the afternoon. We did not see one single customer. So these gentlemen, these merchants that we crossed as we walked through the streets had lots of time to talk to us, and they explained, they pointed overhead, and I looked up and I saw this. It was a net over the cobbled streets of the ancient city of Hebron. And I said, why is that there, and what's all of that stuff? And they said, well, that's the garbage that the settlers who live over us throw down on our heads every day. And we put those nets there to protect ourselves, but they don't particularly work nowadays because they've given to pouring, filthy water down on our heads and sometimes chemicals. And unfortunately, the net doesn't protect us. Rehab and I then walked through a checkpoint into the commercial center of Hebron. And this is what the checkpoint looks like. Behind the barbed wire is the tombs of the patriarchs. And as we walked the streets, we saw many walls like this. These walls have been installed to segregate completely the Palestinian population from the settler population in the center of Hebron. And it was explained to me that the Palestinian children who live on the far side of this wall, in order for them to go to school, they have to cross the commercial center of Hebron. This was explained to me, by the way, by a German national who worked for an NGO. And he said that the children, when they cross, are subjected to so much abuse that representatives of NGOs have to accompany them. The settlers abuse them and threaten them. And we're talking here about grade school children. And when they're in their class in the morning, oftentimes heavily armed soldiers will come in the class and will demand to see the hands of 5- and 6-year-old children to see if there are marks of stones having been thrown. And occasionally, they'll take a child away. Now, in our party policy, despite all of these facts, despite what I can only describe as a human rights horror show in the occupied Palestinian territories, we state the Green Party of Canada believes that any effort aimed only at one side in this conflict will not end the violent responses that exacerbate human suffering. It would be difficult for me to overstate the degree to which I disagree with this statement. In light of the facts that I've just recounted to you, I don't know how anyone in good conscience could agree with it. I prefer the view of Archbishop Desmond Tutu, who stated, "I have witnessed the systemic humiliation of Palestinian men, women, and children. Their humiliation is familiar to all black South Africans. In South Africa, we could not have achieved our democracy without the help of people around the world, who through the use of nonviolent means such as boycotts and divestment encourage their governments and other corporate actors to reverse decades-long support for the apartheid regime. And this is key. If you are neutral in situations of injustice, you have chosen the side of the oppressor." In the Green Party, if we refuse to take a stand with the Palestinian people, let's not kid ourselves what we're doing. We are choosing the side of the oppressor. What does our policy say, this policy that's generated so much so-called division and polarization? Well, I will submit to you that this is a minimalist policy, that all we've done is the bare minimum that human decency requires. We don't talk about anything other than the settlements and the occupation. And we say, we support, we're not forcing anybody to boycott or divest, we're expressing encouragement, support. There's moral suasion in this, nothing more. The use of divestment, boycott, and sanctions that are targeted to those sectors of Israel's economy and society which profit from the ongoing occupation of the occupied Palestinian territories. So it's not a boycott of Israel, because there are many in Israel who do not agree with the occupation. They oppose the occupation, oftentimes at great risk to themselves, such as Gideon Levy. We're talking here about those who profit from a monstrous, brutal occupation. How can we have any qualms about encouraging private citizens and corporate actors not to do business with corporations and individuals who are profiting from that occupation that I have just described to you? How can we have any qualms? And I go on to say in this resolution, which I drafted, that the GPC will support this BDS until such time as Israel implements a permanent ban on further settlement construction in the OPT and enters into good faith negotiations with representatives of the Palestinian people for the purpose of establishing a viable, contiguous, and truly sovereign Palestinian state. Now, if one had wanted to be truly fair to the Palestinians, one would have said, well, actually, we're going to support BDS until they have a state, because you know what, Israel, we just don't trust you anymore. After decades of so-called negotiations, during which you have continued to confiscate Palestinian land in plain violation of international law, nothing has happened. The situation for the Palestinian people has only got worse, so we don't trust you anymore. We're going to demand a state before we withdraw our support for BDS, but we don't even go that far. We say, just stop the settlements, stop expanding them, stop constructing them, enter into good faith negotiations, and we will revisit our support for BDS. As it happens, we're not alone, not by a long shot. 10 years ago, over 10 years ago in 2005, the US Green Party, and we're talking about a country in which hostility to BDS is no less intense than it is here, adopted a policy expressing support for the entire BDS movement, not some narrow aspect of it as we have done. And its leader, Jill Stein, who is Jewish American, was on CNN only months ago defending her party's support for BDS. So too has the UK Green Party. It has supported the full BDS movement, not some narrow aspect of it. And the Scottish Green Party has gone so far as to call Israel a racist apartheid state, which, frankly, it is. I've seen it with my own eyes. It's an apartheid state. We don't even call it that in our resolution. I consciously avoided using these words simply to make it as easy as possible for our party to adopt this policy that is required by minimal human decency. But those words would have been entirely justified. But do we in fact endorse the BDS movement? I say to you that we do not. The BDS movement has 3 goals, and you can see this on the BDS movement's website. One is the right of return of Palestinian refugees, many of whom have spent their entire lives living in squalid refugee camps. I assure you that the right of return is a right that they have. It's a human right that the Palestinian people have. But our resolution says nothing about the right of return. Another aspect, a key plank of the BDS movement is full equality for Arab Israeli citizens of Israel itself, Arab Palestinian citizens, I'm sorry. There are some 50 laws in Israel that discriminate against the Palestinian people. I can't think that anybody within our party would object to our party adopting policies which seek to ensure full equality for Arab Palestinian citizens, but in fact, our resolution does not do that. It says nothing about that. We also only for an end to the occupation of the OPT. The BDS movement goes further, and it calls for an end to Israel's occupation of the Golan Heights, which are not part of the OPT, that's Syrian territory, which has been illegally annexed by the State of Israel. I myself support all of these objectives. I think we should all these objectives. I can't imagine why the Green Party of Canada would not support these objectives wholeheartedly. But in fact, our resolution doesn't go that far. So it's not fair to say that we have endorsed the BDS movement. We have endorsed the use of a tactic for a limited purpose. The limited purpose is to address a crime with respect to which there is almost universal agreement, the violation of the Fourth Geneva Convention by construction of settlements. Now, it's been said to me that this is distracting us from our core mission. Well, our 6 core values are ecological wisdom, and by the way, our core mission is, it won't surprise you, many will say, it's the environment and particularly climate change. We are told this is our signature issue, climate change and the environment. Well, our 6 core values, you can see this in our Constitution, are ecological wisdom, social justice, participatory democracy, nonviolence, sustainability, and respect for diversity. These, as I indicated earlier, are, to my mind, profoundly progressive values. But my point that I want to make at this moment is 4 out of those 6 values are not explicitly related to the environment at all. The words climate change aren't even in there. One of the values is ecological wisdom, another is sustainability, but the other 4 are fundamentally values of human rights. We are constitutionally mandated as a party to have a broader mission than the environment and climate change, as important as those issues are. And this resolution falls squarely within our mission. It is not distracting us from our mission. It is a fulfillment of our mission. What now? The Federal Council has called a meeting, did so on August 21st, in an in-camera session. For the life of me, I cannot understand why the members of the party were not permitted to observe a Federal Council meeting, which raised the question of whether we should revisit policies that had been validly adopted by the members. But that's what happened. It was done in camera. We're now going to Calgary at the beginning of December, and our leader has called for the members of the Shadow Cabinet to engage in discussions with a view to finding a consensual resolution of the BDS issue. Joanne Roberts, who is in this room, and Paul Manley are leading that initiative. They've done fine work in that regard. We've made some progress. I have some serious reservations nonetheless about this resolution. I have accepted their kind invitation to come to Vancouver at the end of October with a view to trying to achieve a consensus and heal the party, unite the party. And I hope that ultimately we can all agree that we are obliged to do what minimal human decency calls upon us to do in the circumstances present. If, however, we cannot achieve a consensus despite our good faith efforts, there may be a vote in Calgary, and at that point in time, the fate of this resolution will be decided.
What has happened here is because the leader of the party, more than anybody else, disagreed with what happened. They've come up with a way to try and undermine it and change it. We've never in the history of the party had another convention outside of the biennials called to deal with a particular issue. And that got done in a closed session of council. Nothing like that's ever happened before. And I think this is once again under threat of resignation. And so what the party is now faced with is a farcical, I consider something the party can't necessarily afford, to spend a couple $100,000 holding another convention, which is going to be relatively poorly attended, other than those people who are subsidized to attend by the organizations like SGI. That you are going to end up having a very small group of people making a decision under the weight and the recognition and acknowledge that the leader will resign if she doesn't get her way. And you don't hold conventions of a party under the threat of resignation by your leaders. And we've had, just in the lead up to it and the amount of discussion around here, you have the leader sent a message out to every member in the country. Nobody else has the right to be able to do that. Dimiti can't. He can't send a note out and explain his position to everybody, but the leader can and sends out a note because she's got access through the party mechanisms to send out to everybody. And the same thing with the riding associations. The SGI just did the same thing last week. There's another plea for more members to go to the convention. and as well as support the new resolution, which to me, if it was an environmental resolution that was being watered down, we would call it greenwashing. And that's exactly the same thing as we're doing here, is, I don't know what the term would be, but washing this down to have a resolution that's watered down, to me, nothing. The same thing happened to your resolution, Corey, and in Ottawa, or at the convention, where it got watered down so that Israel was treated no different than any other country.